Hi everyone. So I'm starting a new series on Patreon called How to Analyze a Score. But it's really not just analysis, it should also be called How to Prepare a Score. And what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at a score that I have never seen before, and you probably have never seen either. And we'll be working through it day by day, week by week, not every day, but whenever I'm working on the score. We'll be looking through it and we'll be not only analyzing it, but preparing it for a rehearsal period. So ultimately, we'll be building it up towards a bunch of rehearsals, and then we'll be talking through how to manage a rehearsal schedule, how to manage rehearsing a difficult piece with good amateurs, but you'll have to think about teaching the score as well. So we're analyzing, we're preparing a score, but we're also thinking about how to teach a score and how to rehearse a score ready for ultimately a performance in a couple of months' time. So I'm really excited about this score. And actually what I wanted to do is share the introduction to this series with all of you, just in case any of you are interested in joining me along for this journey. And if you are interested in this series on how to analyze, prepare, rehearse, and ultimately perform a new score of music, then you can visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/inside the score, and all the episodes to this series will be posted on there. So with all that being said, let's get on with the introduction to this series on how to prepare or analyze or rehearse a score. So years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I was in my second year of undergrad, and I scrawled this very top line where it says number 1 into the front of my collection of Beethoven symphonies 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the Dover collection. But I scrawled this in the top. What it says is harmony, melody and motifs, phrasing, tempi and rhythms, texture, structure, orchestration, dynamics and articulation. This actually comes from a book that I was reading at the time called The Complete Conductor, pretentiously misspelt, by Gunther Schuller, or Americans probably say Gunther Schuller. But actually a really fantastic book on score analysis. It has some amazing analyses on, that's just lost focus, on Beethoven's 5th, Beethoven's 7th, Brahms 1st, Brahms 4th, Strauss, Ravel, Schumann, Tchaikovsky. Amazingly detailed score analysis. And what his whole philosophy is that conductors should try and be as on the score as possible, as follow exactly what the score says. How dare a conductor do something different from what the score says, take a score into their own hands and do something completely different. I don't quite agree with his philosophy anymore. I think a score is a sort of script, and it does afford interpretation. But Schuller is all about getting really deep into the score, really analyzing it, knowing it absolutely inside out. I'd really recommend this if you're learning this kind of thing, because it's not only about conducting, it's about just knowing a score utterly thoroughly. And so that's why those analyses of the Beethoven and Brahms and Schumann and Tchaikovsky are incredibly thorough, because that's just his style. But what he says is that if you're going to conduct a piece, you should know back to front the harmony, the melody and motifs, the phrasing, the tempi and rhythm, the texture, the structure, the orchestration, the dynamics and articulation. And that, for me at the time, that meant let's make several passes of the score. Let's make a pass where I just go through the harmony. Let's make a whole pass where I just go through the phrasing, or just look at the orchestration, or just look at the dynamics. Do one complete pass of the symphony for each of those things. And gradually, the more you do this and the more you get good at it, those things start to infuse with each other, and you start to do more than one of them at once. But I found it a really useful place to start. He's saying you need to know the score back to front. And then a few years later, I still had these with me. I think I was doing Beethoven 2 somewhere, and I read this interview by Barenboim, where he said we need to think about the rhythm, sound, intonation, phrasing, and articulation, and how they influence each other. This Barenboim quote, Barenboim, of course, one of the great conductors living, interpreters of Beethoven and of Wagner, and this sort of great romantic Germanic music, Brahms as well. It's always worth listening to live performances of him doing Beethoven, either on piano or conducting, or him conducting Wagner. It's just stunning. But what struck me about this is that whereas Schuller is saying we need to know the score back to front, these things, particularly sound, phrasing, articulation, these qualities are interpretative. He's saying he's saying that we have to have an imagination as a conductor to imagine what kind of sound we want, what's important in the intonation or the tuning, what kind of phrasing we want, how we want it articulated. And it's more than just knowing the score. It's imagining how these things in our imagination correspond and influence each other. So it's more than just knowing a score back to front and analysing it really thoroughly. It's an act of imagination. I wrote in this quote, I'm not sure where it comes from, probably Schiller, what does the composer mean by that? And then there were some quotes, I think it's Barenboim again, about rehearsal process of it's not about being but becoming. That this whole thing is a process of, and the expression of the group is louder than the sum of its parts. It's all this coming together of the group, and as we learn a piece and as we rehearse a piece, something comes together, and it's not always what you planned, but something special. You sometimes just have to go with what the group's doing because something special will come of it. Again, this quote says, you're playing as if improvising, but only after having digested all the elements of the score. After 200 times, then you improvise. So that's suggesting you have a very firm idea in place of what you want, and you will sort of quite strictly rehearse what ideas you have, but eventually, by the time it gets to performance, if you've rehearsed it enough, or by the time it gets to your 50th performance, if you performed it enough, you can begin to improvise, do new things with it, make this natural, living, breathing music, rather than doing exactly the same thing that we've done every single rehearsal and every single time. That's where this sort of beautiful sense of musical improvisation can come. But you can't improvise it right off the bat. You need to know it back to front and have to have performed it and rehearsed it a lot to get to that point. And again, these last few quotes from Barenboim, understand what the sound does, how the piece is constructed, the different means of expression, what one can do with volume, intensity, speed, and most importantly, how does one interrelate all this and not take the easy way out. So there's a lot to think about here, for sure. And finally, he says, tempo is the last decision for performer once content is understood. Schiller would disagree with this. Schiller would say, if there's a metronome mark, then you must follow it. And I think, within the metronome mark, there's a sort of max speed you can go and a minimum speed you can go, and you should try and stick close to the metronome mark. But it's interesting that Barenboim actually says we should make decisions about tempo after we understand all the other content in the piece. That's something to think about. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it that way. But it's certainly, if Barenboim says it, then it's probably worth thinking about. So this is just an introduction to what I'm going to be thinking about with this whole series of episodes on Patreon, how I'm going to be processing a dense score and how I'm going to be analysing it first and then trying to develop some sense of performance out of it, preparing for rehearsals and ultimately rehearsing it and then doing it in concert. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to this series. And very much hope to see you soon. You can visit patreon.com/inside the score, where we'll be doing this series day by day, week by week. It won't be every day, but it'll be whatever days I am analysing the scores. And it won't always be the same score. Sometimes we'll look at different scores and we'll have glances at other famous masterworks in Western classical music. But I hope you might be interested and you might visit along. One last thing I'd say is that I've been using this fantastic app called Encoder. That's Nkoda. This is just on my iPad, and it gives you access to this massive bank of scores. So you can see I've got these classics here in orchestral music, Scheherazade and Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, Rautavaara's Cantus Arcticus, which, it's not out of copyright, so it's giving you access to music which would otherwise cost quite a lot of money. And you go down here, you've got brand new music from 2019. You've got all this Bach. It gives you curated playlists, so you can get a playlist for Ludovico Einaudi, Past, Reimagined, Renaissance Meditation, which are lovely ideas. There's Macmillan. We'll be looking at Macmillan in some depth in the series I'm giving on Patreon. And all kinds of things. Written on Skin, hugely popular contemporary opera. Thomas Adès, Elliot Carter, John Adams, all kinds of things. And it also, as I say, it gives you not only modern music, but your Bach, your Beethoven, your Rimsky-Korsakov and Dvorak, all that kind of thing. And what's great is that you can just open up a score and click on it and annotate it. So I get full score. I can also look at the flute part and things, and I can click on full score. It'll take a moment to load. But then I can scroll through, click on the page, and annotate it by pulling this out, or tapping this, using a pencil, and annotating something. Oh, there we go. You can't see it. I mean, I'm just showing it to demonstrate. Obviously, you can do nicer things than that. You can highlight things like that. So if you want to follow along with the scores that I'm talking about, you can do by using Encoder. So if you want to follow along with this series, actually use a score to follow along and try doing some of these things yourself. You can go on Encoder, you can find the scores on there, and you can use these tools to annotate your scores. It's they're doing free trials at the moment. It's a subscription service, but you should definitely check it out if you're interested. It's encoder.com. That's NKODA.com. Anyway, I hope that some of you are interested and that you'll be joining me along for the ride. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see a lot of you soon.